Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on the making of contemporary India 1950 to 1990s, today we will talk about the theme women in politics. And as we are aware also that how the emancipation of women was an important concern during the social religious reform movements, and some of the thinkers and reformers of those times, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, etc. They played an important role in the emancipation of women in the 19th century. And thereafter we see that the kind of rights, etc., which were to be given to the women, they were being given to them by the Constitution of India. But women, they played an important role during the national movement as well. And we see that how Mahatma Gandhi brought the women out of the kitchen, and how they became important part of the national movement in the various movements which were launched by Gandhi, be it the non-cooperation movement, civil disobedience movement, where we find a lot of women, they participated in the civil disobedience movement, and then the Quit India movement. So in all these movements, women they became an important or essential part of the movement. They also participated in various other peasant movements and the movements which were there in other spheres as well. And one of the important concerns of all these women participants was to secure the rights for themselves. And what we could see when India was granted independence, and how when the Indian Constitution came into force, the right to universal suffrage which was given to all the adults, and how women they got the right to vote, for which there were a lot of struggle movements across the world. So getting those rights through the legislation was one part, and getting them implemented was another important issue. So what we find that there was a lot of discrepancy at times, the way these laws they were being implemented and applied, and women they were found to be on the receiving end because of this kind of politics which was there. And we also see that how the patriarchal system of the Indian society also played some sort of a role, where a lot of obstacles they were being created for the women. So in this context, we see that the coming of the Hindu Code Bill, how the four different kind of laws they were being applied in that context, and the kind of background where you will find that the Hindu Code Bill when it came. And we also find that how the political leaders they initiated certain legislations, maybe with regard to dowry, with regard to the rape, or with regard to other kinds of violence which were perpetrated on the women, and how these kinds of legislative measures they were being implemented at the ground level, and how women from across the section of the society they were also continuing their fight, so that some kind of redressal of their grievances could be done. In terms of the bibliography or the references, one can see Bipin Chandra's India After Independence, then Committee on the Status of Women in India Towards Equality, then Kumkum Sangari and Suresh Ved edited Recasting Women, M. Chaudhary Indian Women's Movement, Monmay Basu Impact of Hindu Code on Indian Women. So these are some of the readings which one can refer when one is talking about the issues of women in the context of India. And as I told you that how when we tend to understand the contribution which has been made by the women in the national movement, and how the issues of the politicization and the empowerment of women, they were all very relevant in the earlier times, and in the present context as well, that when you will empower women, then only they will be able to secure those rights. You have to make them aware, you have to educate men and women equally, and when women they will be educated, then the entire family will be educated, because then they will pay special attention that their kids are also educated. So what we see that during the national movement, how women they were treated as the political beings, those who had the nationalist feelings, they were capable of continuing their struggle and their sacrifice, And so how women they could come into the public sphere, and many of the women like Sarojini Naidu, Bhikaji Kama, etc., when they came to join the national movement, others they also got inspired seeing such women when they were in the public sphere. And how the women they also went to jails along with the male family members during the national movement, and how thereafter we find that once India became independent, the kind of legislations, the kind of rights which were given by the constitution, they were to be given jobs, and also to inherit the parental property as well. So we find that the participation of women in different spheres, be it in the context of the peasant movements or the trade union struggles, was an important step in terms of achieving the goals which were there in the context of the emancipation and as well as the empowerment of women. And how the separate women's organization which were founded during this period, for example the All India Women's Conference, which was there in 1926. So how these organizations they also played an important role, and with the constitution promising that the complete equality is to be given to be women, so it became some kind of a stepping stone in terms of women continuing their struggle to secure those rights. And we also find that with the kind of rights which the women got, whether it was in the context of the voting rights without any kind of a qualification of any education or property or income, so that was an important milestone in that sense that they became equal partners in terms of choosing the people, those who will represent them in the various legislatures, be it at the central level or at the state level. And we also see that in the context of a Hindu Code Bill, initially a committee under the chairmanship of B.N. Rao, who was a constitutional expert, it was constituted, and who prepared the first draft of the Constitution of India. And he had already gone into this matter and submitted a draft code in 1944. So initially, with regard to the Hindu Code Bill, we find that how some kind of a draft code in this regard was submitted during this time, and thereafter we see that how B.R. Ambedkar, he also submitted a bill which raised the age of consent and marriage during this time, and it upheld the monogamy, gave women the right to divorce, maintenance and inheritance, and treated dowry as stridhan or women's property. So these were some of the important concerns in that bill. But we find that how this bill was opposed by the conservative sections of the society, and how some of the Congress leaders, including the President Rajendra Prasad, they also were hesitant in terms of the acceptance of this bill, and the bill got delayed, and finally we find that the entire bill could not be passed that way, and different bills they were being introduced. One was the Hindu Marriage Act, one was the Hindu Succession Act, Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act, and Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act. So 4 acts they were being in a way brought about, or they were put instead of the one code bill which was thought initially. And we find that the Hindu Code, it aimed largely at filling up these gaps. It had 2 parts. First part was dealing with the marriage. It was passed in 1955. And the second part was dealing with property, and it was passed in 1956. So the right to divorce was eventually granted to women by the Hindu Marriage Act of May 18, 1955, and this is the first part of the Hindu Code which provided for divorce. So we find that these kind of reforms within the lives of the Hindu women, they were initiated by these kind of legislations which were brought up by the people, those who were associated initially with the national movement, and now they were in the government as well. And there was a lot of criticism with regard to the government, that why such kind of laws they were not brought for the entire women of India, why some sections of the women they were left, why they were not included. And we find that the Hindu Succession Act of 1956, it provided a share to a female even in respect of the property owned by a joint Hindu family. So these kind of reforms, they were largely concerned with the Hindus and the associated religions, maybe like Sikh and Jains, etc. They were also being given these kinds of rights by these kinds of acts which came during this time. And we find that the Hindu code it further gave importance to the women in terms of two significant provisions, where the Hindu minority and the guardianship bill, as well as part dealing with the adoption. So we find that these kind of things which came during this time, these kinds of acts which came during this time, how they provided some kind of a relief to the women at this point of time. But the criticism was that why not all women from all communities, they were being given such kind of rights which have been given by all these four acts. And we find that because of the coming of these acts, when the custody of a child who was under the age of 3, it was to be with the mother, and though the natural guardian was to be father, and after him mother. So in that context, women they had this kind of an advantage where they would have this kind of a guardianship of a child who was under the age of 3, and mother was not deprived of her right of guardianship by her remarriage as well. And the widowed mother might also appoint a guardian by will, so long as her husband had not already appointed a testamentary guardian for same minor child. So these were the kinds of advantages which would occur to the women by the virtue of the coming of these kinds of act during this time. And we also find that because of the coming of these acts, no girl below the age of 15 could be married at this time, and monogamy was to be strictly followed, and which would in a way provide some kind of a relief to the women, that if more women will be married by the same men, then it would create a lot of problems in the household as well. So monogamy was an important concern during in these acts, and it was also communicated that marriage was no longer sacrosanct, and divorce could be obtained under certain specific grounds. And we also find that how both sons and daughters, they were given equal footing in matters of inheriting the parental property. So there would be no discrimination in the context of the parental property, that both the boy as well as the girl, they will be given the equal rights. And we also find that how women, they derived right to succession, and their property were to be life estates, and they were being given full authority to dispose of the property in the manner they liked. And at the same time, they also received the full custody of their children, those who were less than 3 years of age. And we also find that how children could not be given in adoption without the consent of the mother, if she was in a position to do so. So all these advantages, they occurred to women because of the coming of all these four acts. And we find that how the extension of the legal rights to Hindu women was not sufficient, but it was a very, very big step forward in that context. And we find that even though stiff opposition was encountered by the government in its attempt to extend the legal rights in the case of other religious communities. So we find that how, because of this kind of the coming of the four acts, and how there was a demand by others that the uniform civil code that should be applied, and the question of uniform civil code is still relevant and debated even now and then at different points of time. And we also find that if we see one of the cases called the Shah Bano case in 1985, and how the Supreme Court it granted a pittance as a maintenance to Shah Bano, who was a divorced Muslim woman. And there was a lot of furor and anger among the conservative Muslim sections, and sufficient pressure was put on the Rajiv Gandhi government for it to wilt and introduce a bill to negate the Supreme Court judgment. So we find that how in 1985 this issue of Shah Bano case became an important concern at that point of time, and whatever decision which was taken by the Supreme Court in her regard was in a way reversed by the Rajiv Gandhi government, and there was a lot of criticism of the government at that point of time, why it did wilt under the pressure of the people, those who were from the conservative section of the society, and how women or entire community of women they were being denied the kind of right which could have been given to them because of the Supreme Court judgment. And we also find that in the context of the right to vote, which was given to the women by the Constitution, and how women, they have been the keen voters, how they are aware or they are consciousness they are conscious of the power of the vote. And we find with regard to the inheritance of the parental property, the legal rights are generally not in a way sought by the women. They are being largely not claimed in that sense, and we find that women generally, they forego their rights in the context of the parental property, and maybe it is because of the reason that some of the conservative people, they argue that how the dowry which is being given, that makes up for the parental property. But legal remedy would be in the context of the equal division of the parental property, so that there is no distinction with regard to the boys and girls. So that is one of the things which has been argued by the progressive section of the society. And we also find that how women's issues they have been taken up by the women's organizations and others as well, the political parties and the grassroots movements. They have also in a way taken up the issues of women, and any kind of gender injustice, maybe in the context of the dowry deaths, rape, and the alcohol related domestic violence. All these they have been time and again talked about in different media, and legislations they have been in a way directed, they have been implemented, and legislations they have been passed in legislatures so that such a kind of injustice could be removed at all levels. And we also find that many of the women leaders, they became involved in the government initiated and other institutional activities for women's welfare, including the rehabilitation and recovery of women lost or abandoned as a result of mass migrations and riots accompanying the partition, and the setting up of various women's hostels in cities and women's vocational centers. So we find that after independence, when the issue of the displacement of women and the issue of the rehabilitation of women was a very, very relevant issue at that point of time, and the women, those who were recovered from the foreign territory, now they were being abandoned, and how these women, they were to be integrated into the society as a whole. And we find that government made a lot of efforts with regard to that, and how the working women's hostels, they were being started in the cities, so that women they could settle themselves in these working women's hostel. And some of the vocational centers, they were also being started so that women, they learn so that the question of livelihood could be settled. We also find that communist women, they left All India Women's Conference in 1954, and they formed the National Federation of Indian Women, which became a party forum and not a broad unified platform for women. So in that context, we find that such kind of measures in a way defeated the women's movement in the long run, because the unity which was there in the earlier conference, which was the All India Women's Conference, got dissipated in some way when you created other forums. And in 50s, 60s, we do not find much evidence of the women's struggles. This is one of the views which has been given by some of the thinkers, as they do not find many women movements after independence till the initiative in the 1970s. But when we tend to understand this kind of a perception, then this perception fails to understand or comprehend the inevitable phases of the consolidation and the quite constructive work which was being done after the intense struggle. So that was also happening, and how the movement got consolidated through the quite constructive work which was being undertaken during this period. And we find that Indian women's movement, it underwent such kind of a phase after independence. And we also see that women, they were able to play an important role in different movements, whether the peasant movements, the tribal movements, farmer movements, trade unions and environmental movements, and how they were able to raise women's issues at different forums. And immediately after independence, before independence, we also see that in a Tibhaga peasant movement in Bengal in 1946-47, when India was to become independent in 1947, just before that, we find that women, they had organized themselves on a separate platform of Nari Bahini, and they ran shelter and maintained lines of communication. So women, they were quite aware of what was happening around them. They were aware of the kind of politics which was happening around them, and they were ready to take such kind of remedial measures at that point of time, so as to increase their participation in different spheres, and also to secure the kind of rights which were to be given to them. And we also find that how rural women, they were also being mobilized on certain issues, and whether in the context of rights to finance and property, and how the village level Mahila Atmaraksha Samitis, women's self defense committees, they were also being formed, which took the issues of wife beating or domestic violence in that stride, and how women, they were to be educated regarding that. And we also find that another major communist peasant struggle of that time in Telangana area of Hyderabad state from 1946 to 50, and where the women's participation was quite significant, and the leadership did not pay attention to women's issues. Leadership did pay attention to women's issues such as wife beating. So that was one of the concerns, and how it was also linked to the issue of liquor, that how the kind of policies which were followed by the different states with regard to the liquor, and where in the states where you will find that there was a prohibition on the sale of liquor, there you will find that these kinds of problems, they were comparatively less, because alcohol related issues created such kind of an atmosphere in the homes, where the issue of wife beating became quite rampant. And Gandhiji also realized such kind of issues, and we find that even during the national movement, the picketing of the liquor shops was one of the important concerns in the agenda of Swadeshi and boycott, the kind of movements which were launched by Gandhiji and followed by so many followers across India and later in the other parts of the world as well. So we will continue in the next lecture about the issue of the women in politics. Thank you very much.